Hello, Jason Barney here for Educational Renaissance. I'm excited to share with you today an expansion of my history of narration. So if you've been following Educational Renaissance for some time, you might know that last year I did this series on why the history of narration matters. Narration is this powerful teaching practice in which we expose students to rich content of some kind and then ask them to imitate it, to tell it back as fully as possible. And there's so much modern research that supports this practice, but the figure that really advocated for it most strongly in recent history was Charlotte Mason, the British Christian educator at the end of the Victorian period and early Edwardian era. And I unpacked in that series how narration actually has this rich tradition going back into the rhetorical training of the classical era and then finding a rebirth in the Renaissance period. And as I was going through that, I talked about John Amos Comenius, the great Czech education reformer of the early to middle Reformation time period. A little bit. I had a few quotations from him, mostly from Karen Glass's book, Know and Tell, The Art of Narrating. And I had a feeling that there was more to it. So I said even at the time that I'm sure there's more to the story of Comenius on narration. I was reading his book, The Great Didactic, for the first time and was working to find his book, The Analytical Didactic, which he wrote much later in his life, and have since read and digested both of those. And now I have more to share that expands the history of narration in Comenius. So I'm really excited to share this with you today. And I am excited in particular because I had the opportunity just last week to visit the Covenant School of Dallas. They're doing some great things there, and to train their faculty in Narration 2.0. They've been practicing narration in their school for many years, but I'm helping them think through how to take it to the next level in their practices. And I used this excerpt from John Amos Comenius to do so. I also trained my own faculty at Coram Deo Academy with this the week before last, and so I'm really excited to share with you because I have in mind some real practical applications that if you've been practicing narration either in your classroom or at your school could help you take it to the next level here. So first, let me situate for you narration and its history. Comenius comes after Erasmus, so if you want to check out either my lectures or the articles, that third one in the series has some on Comenius, but before that it unpacks Erasmus and what he does with narration. And it's really Comenius that I believe turns narration from a progymnasmata or a preliminary training exercise into a central learning method, a method of teaching in any subject. And so I'm excited to show you how that happens. First, I want to preface it with actually John Amos Comenius's preface in The Great Didactic. If you know some of the value of narration, you'll see some connections with what Comenius argues is sort of the golden key that unlocks education in his preface here. He begins by saying this: "Let the main object of this our didactic be as follows: to seek and find a method of instruction by which teachers may teach less, but learners may learn more, by which schools may be the scene of less noise, aversion, and useless labor, but of more leisure," I think of Schole from Chris Perrin, "enjoyment and solid progress, and through which the Christian community may have less darkness, perplexity, and dissension, but on the other hand more light, orderliness, peace, and rest. Now, if you're familiar at all with the practice of narration, you'll see in what Comenius says here the idea of teachers teaching less and learners learning more. Often for teachers who are switching from predominantly modern educational methods to narration are surprised by the feeling of doing very little as students do the work of learning, as they learn more by telling, and the teacher simply watches, supports, and encourages that process. But then there's also what he says here, the idea of more enjoyment in learning and solid progress. And that makes me think of the idea of narration as flow. I've talked about this in an earlier series on the flow of thought, or the joy of learning, a book I wrote. But the idea of flow comes from this positive psychologist, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and he studied the fact that optimal psychological experience, real enjoyment, real happiness, it actually occurs not when you're in your free time doing forms of passive entertainment, but when you're actively engaged in a meaningful activity and your consciousness can kind of fuse with the requirements of whatever activity you're engaged in. Your challenges meet your current level of skills, and you just get in the zone. And I think that narration is one way that we can help students do that in the classroom more. They actually get more enjoyment from their learning when they're not just passive recipients of the teacher talking at them, but they are actively telling about what they have learned. It kind of connects their heart and their mind more fully into the content. And thus they, at the same time as making more solid progress, are enjoying it more. And so that's what we want for them. Well, that's kind of the golden key for education in some ways that Charlotte Mason picks up on. We know she quotes from Comenius at times, so I am pretty sure that she drew explicitly from Comenius, even if she never told anyone she was getting ideas for narration from him. But we also have from Comenius this idea of education serving his irenic vision of how we could stop all the dissension and perplexity and darkness that for him is in particular going on between different groups of supposed Christians. And he lived through the 30 Years' War, a whole bunch of tragedy during his time in the kind of second phase of the Reformation. And so he has high hopes for how education can actually help solve some of the real human cultural problems and problems for Christians in general, those who name the name of Christ. And so I think that also, that hope of Comenius for the power of education to renew the church at large is something that we can connect with as classical Christian educators, something that even Charlotte Mason's movement in Britain can connect with, as well, as she had a similar irenic vision for how to bring people together. Well, with all that in mind, we can dive into the passage that really unpacks it in his Greek Didactic, and it's a section on thoroughness in teaching and learning, which makes a lot of sense. Narration is one of the ways that you attain a high level of thoroughness, both in how you teach and how students are learning. So he opens with, again, this shift being almost announced of narration, not just as a training exercise for rhetoric, a progymnasmata, but as a central learning strategy. Notice his global terms as he says, whatever has been learned should be communicated by one pupil to the other, that no knowledge may remain unused. For in this sense only can we understand the saying, thy knowledge is of no avail if none other know that thou knowest it. No source of knowledge, therefore, he says, should be opened unless rivulets flow from it. And that's my first section here for our talk, expanding narration in Comenius is rivulets flowing out. Again, we can notice how he says whatever has been learned. And isn't it interesting that he envisions one student communicating what he's learned to another student? This almost seems to point towards some of our modern strategies like partner talk or partner narrating. And so he has this image of the value of knowledge, but also the natural communicability of knowledge. It's almost as if there's this law written into the cosmos for Comenius that knowledge itself must be shared. If you're going to take some knowledge in to yourself, you must give it away to others. It's like almost a sacred commandment for him. Knowledge is a communal inheritance that we have to share with one another, or we potentially lose it. And this makes me think of Chris Perrin's classical principle for teaching, docendo discimus, the Latin phrase meaning by teaching we learn. And I think we've got a strong advocate in Comenius of this classical principle. Incidentally, I wonder where Chris Perrin got that idea from, if it's just a traditional conception or if he found that Latin phrase somewhere. But the image for Comenius here is of a fount, right? Knowledge is this fount or source that when you open it, rivulets need to flow out and create streams to others. So knowledge must be communicated. And ideally, I think he would say communicated right away. And this points to the ironic transformation of the student into the teacher. So the way that a student is actually taught best is when the teacher gives knowledge to the student, opens this font of wisdom, and then immediately the student gets transformed into the teacher and begins sharing the knowledge that she gained with someone else around her. Well, this is the rivulets flowing out idea, and it absolutely points to narration as a central practice in the classroom. Are you having students tell and teach the content that you expose them to, that you share with them? Well, that leads us on to our second point from Comenius, is the collection, digestion, and distribution of knowledge. Collection, digestion, and distribution of knowledge. I love the natural images he uses in this one. He goes on in this section to say, from this it follows that education cannot attain to thoroughness without frequent and suitable repetitions of and exercises on the subjects taught. We may learn the most suitable method of procedure by observing the natural movements that underlie the processes of nutrition in living bodies, namely those of collection, digestion, and distribution. And here I would pause and note that Comenius is following his normal method in the Great Didactic of drawing analogies from the created order for how teaching and learning best occur. He's looking at nature and looking for analogies to explain wisdom about teaching. But he goes on. For in the case of an animal, and in that of a plant as well, each member seeks for digestion food which may both nurture that member, since this retains and assimilates part of the digestive food, and be shared with other members, that the well-being of the whole organism may be preserved. For each member serves the other. In the same way, that teacher will greatly increase the value of his instruction who does three things. 1, seeks out and obtains intellectual food for himself. 2, assimilates and digests what he found. And 3, distributes what he has digested and shares it with others. Now, this is a stirring passage First, I want to note his talk about the frequent and suitable repetitions and exercises on. This resonates with retrieval practice, the retrieving from memory something you've been previously exposed to. And we know from modern learning science that that is the gold standard, one of the most effective ways that you can promote durable learning, learning that lasts for the long term. And we know also that it's not simple review that he's talking about when he engages in this discussion of how there should be frequent and suitable repetitions. He has in mind students telling others, as we saw from before. Another thing that we can note here is his use of the mind feeding or being nourished on ideas or knowledge. This is an important metaphor for Charlotte Mason as she talks about the mind as a living organism, tries to get out of the kind of early modern mechanistic view of teaching and learning and think of the mind as a spiritual organism feeding on ideas. And we can see here that she didn't come up with this metaphor, but she's potentially reliant on Comenius here. It's instructive to think of the communal process of sharing knowledge, of collecting it, of gathering it, of digesting it, and then sharing it with others through the image of a beehive. And of course, he uses the terms of members, like members of a body. So we could think of how the stomach digests the food and then sends the nutrients to all the parts of the body through the blood. And of course, that's maybe the most basic thing that's going on there. So you could think of, in a way, a teacher as the mouth and stomach, if you will, the digestive system that then shares with students what's going on. And of course, if we're unpacking his metaphor that way, we might be a little bit confused, because wasn't he talking about students sharing with others the knowledge that they have? But he's really about to make this ironic transformation very strongly stated, how the student should become the teacher. So we could also think of the process of students then taking in intellectual food and sharing it with others. And so there's this kind of unique multiplicity of application to the metaphor. But we should apply it to ourselves as teachers. And I should encourage you to think about, when you're planning your lessons, when you're reading over the material, are you engaging that material as intellectual food for yourself that you're going to digest and then share with those around you, the members of your class who are organically connected to you, mind to mind? Because if you're just thinking of lesson planning as a rote exercise, you're less likely to be effective or as effective as you would be if you were actually getting inspired by the material that you're engaging with, if you were actively learning from it. So I think Comenius here is encouraging us as we prepare, even if we have narration at the center of our lessons, we should still be engaging so well with our material. We should have an intellectual sympathy with the students, as Charlotte Mason says, so that we're digesting it ourselves. We're really taking in the rich feast of living ideas that we then can give them from any subject that we're studying. And that sympathy, that sense of real feeding of the mind is what's part of what's catching to the students as they then take it in for themselves. Now, interestingly, if we could just step over to Charlotte Mason and contrast this, she at times talks about the danger of giving out pre-digested food. But she mainly has in mind bad textbooks, dry as sawdust textbooks that have pre-digested things for the students' minds. And so we can kind of see the duplicity of the metaphor here for her. We should, I think, in a way, from Comenius, be digesting and taking in the intellectual food ourselves, but we should refrain from doing all the work for our students at the same time and breaking it down into just little bits or factoids for them, only to memorize rather than to chew on and discuss as well. Well, we can continue then in what Comenius says here, again, continuing to unpack the collection, digestion, and distribution idea of knowledge. And he does so by giving us this shift to teacher of the student through unpacking this well-known Latin couplet. It goes like this. He says, "These three elements are to be found in the well-known Latin couplet: to ask many questions, to retain the answers, and to teach what one retains to others. These three enable the pupil to become the teacher, to surpass his master." Questioning takes place when a pupil interrogates or asks questions of his teachers, his companions, or his books about some subject that he does not understand. Retention follows when the information that has been obtained is committed to memory or is written down for greater security, since few are so fortunate as to possess the power of retaining everything in their minds. Teaching takes place when knowledge that has been acquired is communicated to fellow pupils or other companions. With the first two of these principles, Comenius says, the schools are quite familiar. We do a lot of that. We have students ask questions, and we have them try and retain knowledge as much as possible. With the third but little. Our schools aren't doing this third one of having the student become the teacher, says Comenius. Its introduction, however, is in the highest degree desirable. The saying, "He who teaches others teaches himself," is very true. Not only because constant repetition impresses effect indelibly on the mind, but because the process of teaching itself gives a deeper insight into the subject taught. Thus it was that the gifted Joachim Fortius used to say that if he had heard or read anything once, it slipped out of his memory within a month. But that if he taught it to others, it became as much a part of himself as his fingers, and that he did not believe that anything short of death could deprive him of it. Well, I love how Comenius relies on this famous man at his day, Joachim Fortius, who was incredibly gifted at learning and knowing things, for support, a kind of anecdotal evidence for the value of narration. As I mentioned earlier, we don't have to rely on anecdotal evidence anymore because of all the incredible research surrounding retrieval practice. And I categorize or catalog a bunch of that in my book, A Classical Guide to Narration, which is published with Circe. There's a link at the end of this blog article if you want to jump on over to the blog to go buy that. But the basic idea is that when you recall something from memory, when you do the hard work of recalling it or retrieving it from memory, that's when you're actually sealing it in. That's when you're enabling or giving the spur to your neural networks to wrap myelin around that set of connections between neurons so that it will be accessible to you later. And that doesn't happen without a spur of effort in retrieving. Your body is not going to waste resources on remembering everything that you're exposed to unless you give it a clear signal that this is valuable information by trying hard to recall it from memory. Now, he also says this idea that the process of teaching actually gives you a deeper insight into the subject taught. And I think we could label that in modern learning science terms as elaboration. When you develop out or elaborate your thoughts on something new you learned by making connections to other things and by developing out your thinking further with it. And so modern research on both retrieval practice and elaboration, the effectiveness of both, I think, supports this idea of the student becoming the teacher. and that really giving a deeper insight, as Comenius says, into the subject that is taught. It becomes as much a part of you as your fingers if you teach something. We want to give our students opportunities to become teachers in the classroom. So I'm just going to challenge you. Are you teaching too much in the classroom? Should you be making your students teach more what you have taught? And we can pause and note that this can happen in so many different formats. But Comenius is going to go on to give us one particular unique one that's quite different from Charlotte Mason's practice of narration in a few ways. I want you to listen close as I read out this next paragraph for how this is different than Charlotte Mason's practice of narration that you may know about already. Comenius says, "This would certainly be of use to many and could easily be put into practice if the teacher of each class," notice he says of each class, "would introduce this excellent system to his pupils. It might be done in the following way. In each lesson, after the teacher has briefly gone through the work that has been prepared and has explained the meaning of the words, one of the pupils should be allowed to rise from his place and repeat what has just been said in the same order, just as if he were the teacher of the rest, to give his explanations in the same words and to employ the same examples. And if he make a mistake, he should be corrected. Then another can be called up and made to go through the same performance while the rest listen. After him a third, a fourth, and as many as are necessary, until it is evident that all have understood the lesson and are in a position to explain it. In carrying this out, great care should be taken," and here Comenius doesn't have quite our sensibilities for politically correct speech about students who struggle. He says, "Great care should be taken to call up the clever boys first, in order that after their example, stupid ones may find it easier to follow." Well, let me pause us there. And we can see a few things going on here. One, it seems as if Comenius is not envisioning a rich text primarily being put in front of students, though that may be intended, but he's envisioning the teacher actually orally explaining something to students, telling them in his own words that he's prepared with his own examples in a particular order, an explanation. We might call it a lecture of something that he wants them to learn. He also has repeated narrations, where Charlotte Mason would just have one narration of the rich text after the fact, with maybe some additions given. Comenius envisions what the teacher says first being repeated many times by many students. And third difference that we see in Comenius is that Comenius wants the teacher to correct the students while they're narrating. Whereas Charlotte Mason had encouraged in her home education that you shouldn't correct a student as he's going because it'll break up his train of thought, and you should just let corrections happen after the narration. Now, how can we explain some of these differences? Well, one, books are not as readily available necessarily in Comenius's day as they are in Charlotte Mason's. So it's more practically necessary for a teacher to explain and give out something. Second, Comenius seems to be primarily envisioning things that are hard to understand being explained fully to students and examples being given. And he seems to be just fine with, in Charlotte Mason's terms, the teacher's explanation becoming the rich texts that students are supposed to assimilate and take into themselves. And so we can imagine that in that situation, it might be better for a teacher to correct students so that a student doesn't go through the process of explaining something wrong and causing all sorts of misunderstanding and confusion for other students who might have understood it. This could also be part of what explains him calling up students that he's more confident will understand it correctly first, because the main goal of the teacher is to get the truth or lesson across correctly to all the students. And so we've got a few things going on there that I think explain what he has going for him. The repeated narrations thing that he's okay with, maybe just because he's not trying to cover as much ground as Charlotte Mason is, and Charlotte Mason sort of trusts the process over time. It seems like Comenius may have in mind giving core knowledge first, a sort of ranking of these are things that are hard to understand, that you need to understand first before you can do all this other reading or work. And we had something similar going on in Erasmus, if you look back at that lecture or article. Well, Comenius gives a few reasons for why this is a great practice to use. This repeated narration of a teacher's explanation with corrections by the teacher to make sure they get it right, practice of narration. And there are a few connections too to things that were valuable or important to Charlotte Mason. So he'll mention the habit of attention. He has a concern for helping weaker students learn. We saw the discussion of the dull student there. Charlotte Mason had used similar terms to talk about a student who has more trouble initially taking in new knowledge of one kind or another. So he's concerned with that. We'll also see him think through the motivation for students. And in particular, you should know that Comenius was in many ways ahead of his time in recommending against the use of any sort of corporal punishment. He has this sense of the value of students, and he doesn't want any corporal punishment to be used, which was rare in his day. And so as you kind of hear him talking about the motivation for students, how they'll be motivated and really enjoy this work of learning, but also be sufficiently challenged to learn well and make solid progress. Listen for that. So I'll share with you now the last part here as he unpacks why this sort of narration practice will be valuable. He says, exercises of this kind will have a fivefold use. First, the teacher is certain to have attentive pupils. For since the scholars may at any time be called up and asked to repeat what the teacher has said, each of them will be afraid of breaking down and appearing ridiculous before the others, and will therefore attend carefully and allow nothing to escape them. In addition to this, the habit of brisk attention, which becomes second nature if practiced for several years, will fit the scholar to acquit himself well in active life. Second, the teacher will be able to know with certainty if his pupils have thoroughly grasped everything that he has taught them. If he finds that they have not, he will consult his own interest as well as that of his pupils by repeating his explanation and making it clearer. Third, if the same thing be frequently repeated, the dullest intelligences will grasp it at last and will thus be able to keep pace with the others, while the brighter ones will be pleased at obtaining such a thorough grip of the subject. And fourth, by means of such constant repetition, the scholars will gain a better acquaintance with the subject than they could possibly obtain by private study, even with the greatest intelligence. And we'll find that if they just read the lesson over in the morning and then again in the evening, it will remain in their memories easily and pleasantly. When by this method of repetition, the pupil has, as it were, been admitted to the office of teacher, he will attain a peculiar keenness of disposition and love of learning. He will also acquire the habit of remaining self-possessed while explaining anything before a number of people. And this will be of the greatest use to him throughout life. Well, let's note a few things from there. the power of attention and the spur of motivation. As Comenius talks about, there's a real peer pressure involved in a classroom. And if you know you're going to be called up to stand in front of others and tell everything you can, you're going to want to do your best effort. You don't want to appear ridiculous in front of your peers. And we can use this natural kind of motivational power to spur students to the effort of attention without any threat upon them. And so I think that's really powerful. I think it's also such a more powerful motivator to do these sorts of practice that requires students to tell right away what they've learned in front of others than it is to hang over them an abstract symbol system like a grade. That is going to have power for some students, but not others. And those students it does have power for may be being turned avaricious, greedy for grades, where they just want the grade for what it's going to give them in future life rather than simply being curious or hungry for knowledge. There's also a particular help in his phrase here of practicing for several years this sort of practice, and in that developing a brisk attention for a student that's going to help the student in later life. I think of how Charlotte Mason in School Education talks about this ability to narrate from a text being a power which a lawyer or a scholar would labor to acquire, but that children can attain with ease if we require them to do narration regularly. It's going to be so helpful to any of them to be able to narrate and speak fluently in front of others. And he makes that clear later, this habit of remaining self-possessed while you're explaining something to other people. There are few things that are more practical for daily life in almost any business or vocation than the ability to confidently explain things to others without being tripped up and worried about that process. This is a gift we should give to our students. It is a rhetorical skill. It's that imitative foundation of rhetoric. There's also a certain reality and sense of actual experience with students that you get from Comenius here when he explains how often teachers can tell about something and think that they've made it clear to students, but the students don't understand. And so the teacher will be consulting his own interest if he re-explains something that the class clearly did not get. And this process of repeating things in order for students to get it fully, I also do think is realistic for a lot of types of things. While I'm a huge Charlotte Mason fan and believe that most of the time, given the amount of ground we want to cover, we may not want to do repeated narrations of every passage or everything that you will explain to a student right then. There are some times where I think it can be incredibly valuable to help students get a real firm grasp of something by repeatedly narrating it. And I'll just tell you, I've practiced this with some students I'm teaching and seen great success for students telling a story better and better. This actually resonates with what John Locke recommends as well, at least a century or so later on, as he recommends repeated narrations with corrections for young students so that they can develop the ability to tell a story well. Well, these considerations end our discussion of John Amos Comenius's The Great Didactic on Narration. And as we've seen, his main push is the idea of the student becoming the teacher, this ironic transformation, and how valuable it is. He who teaches others teaches himself. So the practical application of it that he gives, that you could use in your classroom, is to give an explanation to your students and then have successively multiple of them come up and repeat your explanation of something as fully as possible. And you could correct them, making sure that there are no sources of confusion in what they say, and you'll see the explanations get better and better as there are multiple of them. All right, this is Jason Barney for Educational Renaissance, expanding our history of narration. Hope you have a great day.